I'm 18 years old, and I grew up in Michigan. I've lived in the country for as long as I can remember. On one particularly hot summer weekend, a couple of my friends, including my boyfriend Tony and my older brother Brad, decided we were going to go camping for the weekend. Tony's parents owned a cabin way out in Ludington, surrounded by a huge wooded area with a personal lake and no neighbors for at least 4 miles. But being the stupid teenagers we were, we didn't think about that. We were all ready to party, like any other teens would be. After we were there for 2 hours, the fun had started. Tony's friends brought tons of alcohol, enough to last for the weekend, so we wouldn't be bored, since we had no service in the area and no movies to watch. When the clock struck 12 a.m., it was pitch black, and we had a huge fire going. There were a total of 6 people, including me and Tony. As we talked and laughed around the fire, we were so distracted that we didn't even notice that my brother had frozen. His eyes were fixated on one section of the woods. Keep in mind that we were all intoxicated at the time. Eventually our talking ceased when Tony realized that his friend and my brother had an emotionless expression. "Hey dude, you alright?" he asked. Silence. Brad didn't reply or make any movements that would indicate he heard him. After that, I started to get scared as well, and so did the other 2 girls. It took a lot for my brother to act that way, and eventually we noticed that he was excessively staring at a certain spot in the woods. I turned my head and followed his gaze the best I could, and when I finally caught on to what he was staring at, my heart dropped. Right there, in the woods, was a dog. At least that's what I thought it was. It was some person's dog that had just wandered off. But then my brain kicked in, and I realized that there weren't any neighbors for miles. So how could there be a dog? My mind started to race while Tony still tried to get Brad to speak or move. In one motion, the dog stood up tall. And when I say tall, I mean gigantic. It had to be at least 6 feet. Everyone saw it. How could you not? The others gasped when they finally realized why my brother was still as a stick. No one moved for what seemed like hours. Then Tony muttered, "No tail." No one heard except Brad, and I swear to you when I say his eyes widened as big as pan saucers. That freaked me out immediately. "What did you say?" one of the other girls asked. "It has no tail," he hissed at her. My heartbeat stopped. He was right. There was no tail on that thing. Suddenly, my clouded mind cleared up in a fraction of a second when I realized what that thing was. Now I understood why my brother was basically in a trance. That thing was a skinwalker. My instincts kicked in right then and there, but before I could nope out of there, the thing let off a terrible stench like rotting meat before screaming a terrible sounding scream. The sound was enough to scare the crap out of everyone. My brother was first up out of his chair. He started shouting native words to the creature, while I told everyone to get inside. No one questioned me when they saw how dead serious I was, especially Tony. He's never seen me so scared, so it was a bad situation. We all hightailed it into the cabin, with my brother in tow, still shouting native words at the creature, which seemed to keep it at bay while we got inside. He slammed and locked the door before turning off all the lights. Then he grabbed a special ash from the kitchen counter and started throwing it at every window and door while chanting. Of course he had everyone freaked out and basically in tears at that moment. After he was done, no one said a word for a long time. All of us were still in shock. He grabbed our dad's pistol and had it close to him for hours. Everyone was entirely too shaken up to even question what happened. We must have fallen asleep eventually, because I woke up to my brother packing all his stuff into the 2 cars early in the morning. I understood why. We had native family, so we knew what we were dealing with, and we knew it could come back eventually, and maybe not alone. Before we left, I did a blessing on the cabin, and spoke a few calming words to the still very freaked out girls. We left as soon as everything was packed. To this day, we still haven't explained exactly to our friends what happened that night. They never bothered to ask us either. My grandparents always wanted to do something different when they retired, and my grandpa had always liked the mountains, so they decided to get a cabin in the mountains. It was about 2 hours from our home. One weekend they invited my parents, my brother, and I to stay up there with them. We agreed, so we went up the following day. When we arrived, I was bored, and so was my brother. I was 11 years old, and he was 16. We were roaming around, trying to find something to do. We walked down to a hill near the cabin, and sat by the road. When we reached the bottom of the hill, which was basically just a forest, we found a long rope hanging from a giant tree. My brother and I turned this rope into a swing, and soon everyone was enjoying it. I already felt creeped out by the area. We could hear barking dogs in the distance, and the trees were thick, with drop-offs to new hills. I couldn't help but feel uneasy, even though we were having fun. My brother and my mom found a treehouse that looked like it hadn't been occupied in a while. I was too freaked out to go inside, but they thought it was fine. We spent most of our time playing outside with the swing and hiking. Eventually, we left the cabin and returned home. When we did that, my brother went to his room and started playing on his phone. Later, he came out of his room and told my mom that he'd been taking pictures of the cabin, and he started to show them to us. As I said before, when you went out the back door of the cabin, there was a hill that led to the trees. We had taken some pictures around that area. When he showed them to us, we couldn't help but be freaked out. I don't have the best memory of exactly what it looked like, because I only got one glance, and it was a while ago. But I do remember that I was freaked out. In the corner of the photo, almost perfectly set up, was the shadow of a person wearing all black. They were just standing there in the corner of the picture, with a black hood covering their head. I don't know how we didn't see or notice that person, how my brother had taken a picture that close, and we didn't even see him standing there. How could we all have been there and not heard that person walk by? And why were they just standing there, looking at the camera? I was definitely freaked out and a little wary to return to the cabin again. I did return though, a few months to a year later, with a friend of mine who was also my neighbor. We were driving from the town, which was about 15 minutes away from the cabin. I was scared because it was night, and all we could see was in the car's headlights. It was one small road in the middle of just trees and blackness, and I heard my friend say, "That was creepy." I asked what, and he said that he'd seen someone standing at the side of the road in the pitch black night. Both incidents were too creepy for me, and I still get freaked out when I think about that guy in black just watching us. I returned a few more times, but eventually my grandparents sold the cabin. After they sold it, I've not been back, and I wonder if the new owners ever go down to that swing, and if they'll ever encounter the man in the black hood. I used to live in Japan, but I recently moved to a town somewhere in America. There was a story going around that a cult had a cabin somewhere in the woods near our town, and that they were doing incantations, summoning spirits and specters, the usual paranormal stuff. Me and my friend Jack, who I met when I first moved to the town, didn't really believe in the paranormal, so when we had the opportunity to do so, we would camp near the section where the cabin was rumored to be, and we would just search around for it. It didn't take long before we found it. The cabin was completely hideous. It was infested with cockroaches, spiders, and even some centipedes. The left side of the cabin was decayed slightly, and the right side had a bit of a termite problem. At first it looked like an old rundown cabin. Then we took a second, much closer look. It had a horrible stench. I gagged and almost vomited. Even though I was busy dealing with the stench, Jack was able to get a close look at the walls. They were covered with creepy symbols and signs, upside-down crosses, and blood-red eyes. I thought of calling the police, or simply running. Jack, however, horrified as he was, insisted on going into the cabin. "I'm not believing this. It's probably just really good deco," he said. As reluctant as I was, I pushed onward, Jack leading with his flashlight. We opened the door slowly. That's when I couldn't take it anymore. I vomited onto the grass to the left of the cabin. The reason I vomited was that the stench had gotten even worse. Just in front of the door was a dead deer. It had been butchered and left to rot. That must have been the source of the horrible smell. Jack gently pushed it to the side so we could get in. He waited a bit for me, and we kept going. The inside was very much like the exterior, creepy symbols carved into the walls. We went into the main living room of the cabin. It had a big ritual circle. The walls were different too, this time now sporting words such as devil, beast, our master, and the end. It was all blood red, and I think the blood was real. The scariest thing about it was that the blood was still wet, meaning that it must have been fresh and done recently. That was when I had it. I couldn't take any more. I turned to the cabin door, and that's when I saw something that I can never unsee. About a quarter mile from the cabin, I could see a group of 5 or 6 people approaching. They were dressed in all black. I think they were all men, but from that distance, I'm not really sure. We couldn't go out the front without being seen, so we bolted to the back of the cabin. I found a window, the only window in the entire place. I tried to open it, but it simply didn't budge. It was dark by then, so we crouched down and hid behind a pile of debris. We huddled down there and waited, and eventually we heard the group enter the cabin. It would be impossible for me to explain what we heard that night, but I can tell you that it was some kind of a ritual. I don't know anything about that kind of stuff, so I can't tell the meaning of any of it, but it was incredibly creepy. Jack and I stayed hidden for hours, waiting for a chance to leave. The sun had risen by the time we were able to come out. I tried the window again, and now that it was daytime, I could see that it was locked. I unlocked it and opened it. How silly I thought I was not to check. I made a mental note to always do that, and then I climbed out the window. Jack followed me. We ran back to our campsite, and Jack went to his tent while I went to mine. I recapped what happened, and then put this into my diary. Though this wasn't the nearest near-death experience I've ever had, it was definitely the most extreme. I waited for Jack to wake up, and then we headed back to town. I've never told anyone about this until now.